Donald Goines was a big-time author. He wrote about crime, drugs, time in prison, drawing from his own experiences. And there are some people who believe it was his writing that may have gotten him killed.
On October 21st, 1974, in Highland Park, an independent city enclosed within Detroit, prolific author Donald Goines and his partner Shirley Saylor were found shot to death inside their apartment on Cortlandt Street. Both of them will be riddled with 5 .30 caliber rifle bullets, and their bodies were discovered in separate rooms. 2 of Goines' young children were inside the home at the time of the killings, but were unharmed. According to the police, the scene would suggest an execution-style double homicide, but no suspects would ever be charged, and the case remains unsolved to this day. At only 36 years old, Donald Goines had accomplished more than most authors ever would in a lifetime, in 5 years. During that stretch, he would publish 16 novels, a pace unmatched not only by other Black writers, but by nearly any named author of his era. His books would spread from the streets of Detroit to prison yards across the country, and eventually onto a college campus in New Jersey. He lived fast, he wrote fast, and his death was a lot like many of the characters he wrote about. Violent.
Lord forgive me for this trap shit. Sergeant Smack make it backflip. Telly Hank with the action. With the vital speaking Spanish. Frank Matthews how I vanish. Poof. Came back like I'm King Tut. Gold BBS is on a beamer. When Fat Cat was 10 queens up. Ball off the profit, not the re-up. Fly like Puerto Rican Jesus. Uptown like I'm Baby May. Just caught a touchdown from the bay.
This mighty demonstration is featured by distinguished personalities and masses of manpower. New York at war, and Annapolis midshipmen march to represent the fleet. That float represents Latin America.
America remembers its great wars, the triumph of World War II, a generation crowned as heroes, celebrated in our history books, in the films from Hollywood.
Against the war, followed by anti-war protests in England and Australia in 1963. The largest of the war occurred on April 17, 1965, when 15 to 25,000 protesters marched on Washington, D.C.
It also remembers Vietnam, the protests in the streets, the images that scarred the nation carried home on the evening news. A war never forgotten because the wounds never closed.
Following the Chinese nationalist expulsion from China, the threat to Formosa, the long drawn-out battles in Malaya and Indochina, communist attacks in fact throughout Southeast Asia, there comes open aggression in Korea. Here, the Russian-dominated North Koreans launched a full-scale, well-prepared drive on the capital of the South, Seoul.
But between those 2 wars was another one. It ended without a victory, without closure, overshadowed by the triumph before it and the chaos that came after. This was Korea, the war that history forgot. From 1950 to 1953, over 600,000 African American soldiers fought in that forgotten war. They faced enemies abroad only to return home to face segregation and discrimination on their own streets. For them, the war was never forgotten. And amongst those soldiers was one who should have never been there at all. He wasn't even old enough to serve. 16 years old, a boy from Detroit. His name was Donald Goines. He would survive the forgotten war, but his greatest battles were still ahead.
The skills go back to the days of flipping coins. Past time reading books by my man Donald Goines. Spice suckers, motherfuckers, Donald Goines.
silky days, satin nights, taking flight, Donald Goines.
I'm the active follow, how's the kids like Watto, Mac like Donald Goines, flows I change like coins. This is our world, join the effect, clean your ears for that Donald Goines with a pen. Start a pet store with these birds, I'm the rap Donald Goines with words.
I know you like a Donald Goines nigga. That's your time.
Look, because you're looking at a crook, my life have been took right out of Donald Goines' book. See, I did the draws. Damn, look, there goes a black girl lost. With so much drama at QVC, it's kinda hard being Escobar. El Dorado Red, sipping Dawn out the bottle. My life is like a Donald Goines novel. Follow your mind's boggle, but I'm as deep as Donald Goines novels. My whole persona. I picked up a couple books by Donald Goines about the business of this shit. How to flip.
Center of America's great automobile industry marks the 50th anniversary of its beginning. Birthplace of the production line and the new idea that almost everybody could have a car. Today, still looking forward, the Motor City pauses to look back. Down the main street of the city moves the history of the American motor car. These rattling relics were the beginning, the birth of America's greatest industry, which since 1900 has produced 77 million automobiles.
Detroit in the 1950s was a city on top of the world. The auto industry had powered America's victory in World War II, and in the post-war years, the jobs kept coming in. It was said that men would line up at the factory gates in the morning, knowing they'd find work by noon, and families moved from the South to claim their share of that promise. By the 1950s, Detroit was the fourth largest city in America, thriving with union wages and middle-class dreams. But beneath all of that prosperity, though, the ground was already starting to shift. Automation would slowly replace human hands on the line, while white flight was occurring, seeing families flee to the suburbs, leaving neighborhoods hollowed. And by the year 1967, Detroit would change forever when racism would spark a rebellion that would set the city on fire, painting the picture nationally of Detroit's image. And by the early 1970s, when the plants started to close up and unemployment was spreading, I'm sure for a lot of the people that looked at the Motor City as an opportunity would start to feel like a trap. This was the city Donald Goines returned home to from war, already carrying scars of his own.
In 100 places, Detroit is afire. 100 square blocks are now under siege. And as you walk through the area, people shout from their homes, "Watch out for the snipers."
It began early one Sunday morning in late July. Police raided an unlicensed bar in a black neighborhood in Detroit. A crowd gathered. Tempers flared.
This is going to happen all over America. It's going to be a hot world, not a hot summer. It's a hot world.
A rock was thrown, and the city became a war zone.
How have you been handling this situation?
Well, I think that we can't overpraise the way that the local officials have handled this matter. I think that finally it's become painfully clear that we can't isolate the problems, that they are spreading indeed throughout the whole city.
Entire blocks have been leveled by fire and pockets of destruction exist throughout the city. Losses due to fire and looting have been estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, and these estimates may well prove to be conservative. We've called up the full National Guard, and we should have by tomorrow morning about 6,000 to 7,000 National Guardsmen here, as well as the additional state police and, of course, the full Detroit Police Department.
The United States
States ain't doing nothing for us, man. We busted our ass. We went over there to an army to kill, and 99% of us got killed, and we didn't get nothing for it. They give us a piece of paper that says to us.
By the late 1960s, Detroit had begun unraveling. The riots in 1967 would leave entire blocks vacant, and that auto industry that had once guaranteed steady paychecks was on its way out. And for Donald Goines, the city he came back to after the Korean War no longer looked like the Motor City that he had left. But even worse than that, addiction had already sunk its claws into him. And to feed it, he turned to robbery. By the mid-1950s, he was arrested and sentenced to federal prison, where he would spend stretches of the next decade cycling in and out as his heroin habit would pull him back into crime. It was said to be during one of those stints, when he was locked up in Leavenworth, that he would find a book that would change his life, Pimp by Iceberg Slim. And for the first time, he saw somebody take the world that he knew, hustlers, addicts, pimps, and turn it into literature. Goines picked up a pen and began to write, drafting stories inside his cell that would follow him back onto the streets. And by 1971, his first novel, Dope Fiend, would hit the shelves, a raw portrait of addiction that set the tone for everything else that would follow. Horror Son would come later that year, telling the story of a child born to a prostitute and destined for the streets. And in 1972, he would release Black Gangster and Street Players. That very next year, in 1973, he would introduce the Kenyatta series under the name Al C. Clark. The publishing company of his books, Holloway House, would push for the alias to avoid oversaturating the market with too many Donald Goines books at once. But while researching, I also read that it was possibly done to give him the space to release those more militant style books, which I'm sure a lot of y'all possibly read them and noticed that they carry a more sharper political edge than the previous released titles. Under Clark, he would bring out Crime Partners and Death List before adding Kenyatta's Escape in 1974. But he was far from done. That same year, he would also publish Never Die Alone, White Man's Justice, and Black Man's Grief. 16 novels in less than 5 years, an output that would rival Pulp's fastest writers, and a 5-year run that would cement him as one of the most unflinching chroniclers of urban Black experience ever. But his output would be ended abruptly in 1974 when his life was cut short in a burst of gunfire. And just like the twists and turns that he would write about in his novels, his murder was never simple, as Eddie B. Allen Jr., the author of The Low Road, The Life and Legacy of Donald Goines, would explain.
I think it remained the cold case for a reason, you know, one of them obviously being that 50 years is a long time. There was no DNA technology or anything like that back then, but I did have the opportunity to interview Walter Williams. Walter is in the book, and Walter was one of his running buddies, one of Mr. Goines' partners in crime, literally, and a good friend. And he swears that he knows exactly who killed Mr. Goines because he describes one day that they were playing chess, and he says two tall, like huge oak tree like figures, he said rotten teeth, he described them as what appeared to be junkies themselves, but he said they showed up, two white guys, scraggly hair, and he said that you know, the reaction from Mr. Goines was instant fear. He explained how Mr. Goines said, hold on a minute, and he took them and took these two guys into the bathroom and closed the door. And Walter describes kind of just hearing bits and pieces of the conversation, and he's hearing Mr. Goines say, well, my family's here right now, you know, just give me some time. Walter believes it was a drug debt because I believe something like a week or so later, Walter said was when the murder occurred. Now, is that definitive? No, but there's theories, even more than one like that he was killed over drugs, over a debt he owed. There are people who have a very strong belief that he just got too close to the truth in his novels, and that he was killed for, I guess you might call it a form of snitching, if that's, the language that you use, but snitching in the sense that he's writing about lives of actual people who are doing dirt on the street and they didn't like it. There are theories of all kinds, and it troubles me every time I'm asked a question about.
After his death, Donald Goines' publishings wouldn't vanish. They would move through Detroit neighborhoods, into libraries, and into prison cells, passed from hand to hand until an entire generation knew his words. For many readers, his novels felt less like fiction and more like lived testimony, a mirror of experiences rarely acknowledged in print. And for the men behind bars, many of whom had possibly never really cared for formal education, his paperbacks would become the lessons that they couldn't ignore. And in a way, Donald Goines may have taught more black men to read than any public school system ever did, pulling them in with stories when nothing else ever could. And the resonance of that literature would carry all the way into hip-hop, with Tupac going on to call Donald Goines a father figure, and Nas borrowing the title Black Girl Lost directly from his 1973 novel, Jadakiss describing Donald Goines' work as an obsession in a Vibe magazine interview. And it would be mentions like those, amongst many others, that would turn his books into part of rap's language. But outside of the music, his stories were already embedded in black culture itself, shaping conversations, giving voice to everyday survival, and offering representation that the mainstream normally ignored. But even 3 decades after his death, the recognition would reach academia. In 2004, Rutgers University would place Dope Fiend on the syllabus alongside writers like Herman Melville and Frederick Douglass, which was a powerful acknowledgement that Donald Goines' street literature had become part of American literature. And 50 years on, his story is still being revisited with a new documentary that was announced by Detroit Sun, returning to the life and legacy of a writer whose voice continues to travel far beyond the years that he spent on Earth.
It's been half a century since an author from Highland Park and his partner were murdered.
And a lot of people are still asking questions. A documentary in the works trying to get to the bottom of exactly what happened. Jacqueline Francis talked with the private investigator on the case. She's live in Detroit right now for us. And Jacqueline, what have they been able to uncover on this?
Donald Goines was a big-time author. He wrote about crime, drugs, time in prison, drawing from his own experiences. And there are some people who believe it was his writing that may have gotten him killed.
When you look up the prolific authors, tell me how many can claim they sold 25 million books.
25 million books sold, making Donald Goines one of the top-selling authors ever. But his life story was cut short. At 15, Goines lied about his age to join the U.S. Air Force. After, he became addicted to drugs and landed in prison. He then became an author, publishing 16 books in under 5 years. But did his writing get him killed?
Fairly certain that the last book he was working on touched some lives that didn't want any exposure whatsoever. He actually articulated to someone that, yes, this will likely be my last one, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to finish it.
This is just one theory private investigator Bill Proctor is exploring. Goines and the mother of his 2 children were murdered in their Highland Park home on October 1st, 1974. Why was this never solved?
That's a question that could bring up an ugly answer. He was just a junkie. They were junkies. Who cared? And who was serious about solving this horrible murder, despite the fact that 2 very young children were in the same building at the same time.
Proctor has teamed up with the documentary crew in making a film that explores Goines' murder.
The people would want to know what happened to what could be their favorite author, so now's the time.
Now's the time. That documentary should be out next year. In the meantime, if you know anything about Goines, his life, his death, big or small, you're asked to give a call to 586-873. It's hard for me to see. It should be on your screen. I was looking at the bright lights. But we have all this information on our website, clickondetroit.com. Reporting live in Detroit, Jacqueline Francis, Local 4.
Yeah, we've got that number right there. And of course, it's on our website too. Jacqueline, thank you.